So welcome to our virtual Wayland Library event. Tonight we're excited to have Katie Woods here to talk to us about African American women in Boston's suffrage movement. Katie is a Student Conservation Association public historian with the National Park Service. Her research is focused on Boston's suffrage movement and women's activism at the turn of the 20th century, with particular emphasis in elevating the voices of African American women. She graduated from Northeastern in 2019 with an MA in Public History and a certificate in the Digital Humanities. So thank you so much to Katie for being here tonight. I have a couple Zoom housekeeping notes. We are recording this session for broadcast on Waycam, our local cable access station. So it will be available on their channel and on their YouTube page. And unless you hide your video, you may see a tiny picture of yourself on the screen. During the slide portion, as Katie's talking, I recommend that you switch your view to side by side. You should see that at the top of your screen if you're on a laptop or a desktop. And I'll put this into the chat so you can check it there. And feel free to add your questions to the chat at any time. We're going to hold them until the end, but if you are afraid you're going to forget, feel free to type them in and we'll make sure that we get to them at the end of the presentation. So now that we got that out of the way, I am going to try to unmute Katie. That would be a good idea. There she is. And hand it over to her. Welcome.
Great, thank you all for joining us this evening. Let me just start sharing screen. Can you all see that? Perfect. So as I begin this talk, I would like to take a moment to note that the National Parks of Boston rests on the unceded land of the Massachusetts peoples. I acknowledge that many historical institutions were founded upon the exclusion and erasure of many Indigenous peoples, and this acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. I also acknowledge my privileged identity and position as a white woman sharing these stories of Black women. I recognize that I will never fully understand the experiences of these women who keenly felt their dual status as women and as African Americans. I admire their tenacity, their perseverance as they faced obstacles, and their ability to forge paths for themselves. Throughout this talk, I hope to serve as merely the vehicle to elevate their stories, using their voices as well as the voices of Black contemporaries, publications, and scholars whenever possible. With this and similar programming, the National Parks of Boston hopes to highlight the diversity of the American experience throughout our history. There we go. Quote, "There is no class in the United States that suffers under such disadvantages as the colored woman. This class has everything to gain and nothing to lose by endorsing the women's suffrage movement. Race prejudice is expressed in many ways, but the exhibition of it is often crushed when a vote is wanted." Bostonians Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin and her daughter Florida Ruffin Ridley published this earnest editorial statement in their nationally recognized Black women's publication, The Woman's Era, in 1895. Fervent advocates for women's suffrage, these women saw the vote as an opportunity for Black women to ensure their voices would be heard. And while they, along with many other Black women suffragists, likely knew the vote would not erase all levels of injustice they faced, they saw it as a necessary first step. For African American women, the struggle for the vote served as a path forward as they continued their generations-long work for greater representation and political and social equality in the United States. Long before the term intersectionality existed in our common language, African American women felt their dual identity as women and as African Americans. They faced prejudice and discrimination, racist and sexist laws, barriers that blocked them because of their gender, their race, or both. Inherent in their fight for equality as women was their fight for equality as African Americans. Historian Martha Jones notes in her recently published pivotal work, Vanguard, quote, "The vote was never Black women's only strategy or goal. They constructed their political power with one eye on the polls and the other on organizing, lobbying, and institution building. They dreamed big about women's rights and aimed high, committed to using their power to win the dignity of all people. She notes they were willing to work alongside others with African-American men and white men and women, but they were also willing and not afraid to forge their own paths. All the while, they maintained the mission of, quote, winning women's power that would serve all humanity. When we examine African-American women's participation in the women's suffrage movement, we have to recognize this broader lens. Rosalind Turwood Penn, noted as one of the leading scholars on African-American women in the suffrage movement, argues that Black women suffragists were the, quote, most unwavering advocates of universal suffrage for all. She and Martha Jones advocate for this broadening of our views. We cannot just look at Black women in the suffrage movement without considering their larger fight for justice, equality, and representation for themselves and for members of their race and gender. For many Black women suffragists, the vote was seen as one potential weapon that could help them combat prejudice and discrimination, achieve their long desired and deserved rights, and most importantly, help better their communities and society as a whole. So tonight, we are going to spend some time considering what it means to believe in a wide-ranging view of equality and representation, and how Black women in Boston continuously held this wider view, knowing that their work in the women's suffrage movement had to go hand in hand with their work on behalf of Black communities. We will piece together stories that give us a sense of the different ways in which Black women in Boston participated in the fight for the vote in the many decades of the suffrage movement from the early 19th century into the 20th century. We will see how they used the platform and tools available to them in speaking out for suffrage, how at times they joined with white activists in the fight, while at other moments they formed new spaces and opportunities for them to continue their broader work. We will consider what it meant for Black women to fight for not just the vote, but for a better world for themselves, their communities, and as they rightfully saw it, for all humanity. So this will by no means serve as a complete history, but in providing some stories that span the women's suffrage movement, I aim to show the agency of Black women affiliated with Boston who contributed to the movement for women's rights as well as civil rights for African Americans. So when we think of, while we think of Seneca Falls in the year of 1848 as the beginning of the story of the women's rights movement, it would actually be beneficial for us to start our timeline a little bit earlier. Women spoke out in favor of their own rights before Seneca Falls, during a time while many men and women were not yet ready to hear or see women take part in such public activism. Living in Boston's free Black community on Beacon Hill, Mariah Stewart stepped into the public eye as an activist in the early 1830s. She had married a prominent local merchant, James Stewart, in 1826, and they lived in the growing Beacon Hill Black community, which served as a home to a burgeoning class of civically engaged individuals. When her husband died after a few years of their marriage in 1829, Mariah Stewart turned to her writing as a means to support herself. William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of the new abolitionist paper, The Liberator, published her first work, Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality. And we can see an advertisement for that here. So influenced by her religious beliefs, Stewart referenced the Bible while arguing against racism and slavery. She called on the Black community to take action against the injustice posed against them. Stewart soon turned from the written word to the spoken one, stepping onto the speaker's platform herself. In 1832, Stewart became the first woman to speak publicly on political issues to an audience of both men and women in Franklin Hall in Boston. Her speeches and writings condemned slavery and racism against African Americans, while also specifically recognizing and questioning the oppression of Black women. She asked, quote, "How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles?" And she then called them to action, quote, "O ye daughters of Africa, awake, awake, arise. No longer sleep nor slumber, but distinguish yourselves." Mariah Stewart spoke to her experiences as a Black woman, and she encouraged women to engage in activism. She believed women deserved a place at the front alongside men in fighting for civil rights. And although not advocating specifically for women's suffrage, she encouraged Black women to advocate for their own voices to be heard. So even in the Boston Black activist community, hearing the words from a woman seemed too much for some Black and white male leaders. The community's opposition to Stewart's outspokenness actually forced her to leave Boston. Even in her last public speech in Boston shortly before she left in 1833, Stewart spoke to the power of women. Quote, "God at this eventful period should raise up your own females to strive, by their example both in public and private, to assist those who are endeavoring to stop the strong current of prejudice that flows so profusely against us at present." Despite Stewart's lack of success, she had made the first difficult step into the public space of activism. Her actions led the way for other women to begin speaking in public on the cause of equal rights. Mariah Stewart provides us with the necessary starting point as we examine how African-American women spoke on behalf of their race and gender within the landscape of Boston. The abolition movement offers us a bridge from the time of Mariah Stewart to the launch of the women's rights movement in the mid-1800s. Abolition provided an opportunity for women who followed in the footsteps of Mariah Stewart to begin taking the stage more prominently than ever before. And while some still faced ridicule for speaking publicly, women's public activism gradually became more accepted. Boston in particular served as an active center for fervent abolitionism in the decades leading to the Civil War. Members of the Black and white communities of Boston often collaborated during this time, working together to end slavery. And anti-slavery organizations gave Black and white women, as you see here, greater access to the public through meetings, anti-slavery events, and access to publication. The early women's rights movement grew out of this abolitionist movement as women began to apply the same language of equality and justice often described on the anti-slavery lecture circuit to their own status as women. So 2 years after the smaller yet more well-known Seneca Falls Convention, activists held the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester in October of 1850. This meeting launched what became known as a decade of women's rights conventions, during which national, regional, and local conventions flourished. Delegates convened to discuss the subject of women's rights, from suffrage and political representation to education and property rights. Many Bostonians partook in these conventions, and several conventions even occurred in Boston itself. So resolutions and meetings often discuss, quote, equality before the law without distinction of sex or color, thus linking the abolitionist and women's rights movements. However, what perhaps is most notable is how the voices of Black women are either limited or absent in the historical record of many of these conventions. A few Black women, including Sojourner Truth and Massachusetts native Sarah Parker Remond, visibly participated in national women's rights conventions during this decade. This raises some questions for us. You know, as these and other notable African-American women were quite active in the abolitionist meetings and circles. So why don't we see their voices come through more strongly at these women's rights conventions? Have their voices been overshadowed? Or was their presence at abolitionist meetings marked more important than their presence and participation at women's rights meetings? And looking at conventions specifically in Boston during this decade, my research has not yet provided any definitive information about the presence of African-American women at these events. Sources generally indicated only those who organized or spoke at the events, and of those whom I could identify, they have all been identified as white. So again, this does not mean that African-American women were not present, but it does again provide us with more questions than answers. If abolition and women's rights, these movements were so well linked together, so intertwined, especially in Boston, why weren't Black women in leadership for public positions at these conventions? And while we see white women make these connections between oppression due to race and oppression due to sex, it was African-American women who faced both of these oppressions. So why aren't we hearing from them more? So despite this idea of interracial cooperation, it may be the case that not all African-American women were either fully welcomed in these spaces, or they might have had to work harder to even enter these spaces in the first place. So this dual dedication of activists to the causes of African Americans and women actually led to a reckoning in the years following the turbulent Civil War. Activists had to consider whether to focus on preserving African American men's citizenship and voting rights with the 14th and 15th Amendments, or to try to include women's rights in these amendments. Some, including Bostonian Lucy Stone and many former Black and white abolitionists, believed in eventual universal suffrage and argued in favor of laying a groundwork of support for women's suffrage. This differed from the views of other women's rights activists, notably Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who desired the vote for women at almost any cost, willing to put the rights of white women ahead of African American men, and often expressing racist beliefs in their reasonings for doing so. So this disagreement resulted in the fracturing of the suffrage movement in 1869, with Boston serving as the headquarters of one faction, the American Women's Suffrage Association, the AWSA, while the other faction, the National Women's Suffrage Association, NWSA, organized in New York. So African American women joined both of these organizations, though specific numbers remain unknown. Neither organization devoted much attention to Black women's issues, and in some cases had too narrow of a vision. But despite these issues and likely various levels of racism and discrimination, some Black women did join and navigate these organizations in order to push for progress. So Boston became the natural home for the AWSA, as many of its organizers and leaders hailed from the area. Due to Boston's abolitionist community, AWSA also appeared more firmly rooted in the abolitionist tradition, particularly in the belief of equality across race and gender. Some of the most well-known African-American activists known to have participated with this organization included Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Charlotte Fortin, Lottie Rowland, Caroline Ramon Putnam, and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. The regional and state organizations that were established in 1870. These were the New England Women's Suffrage Association and the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, respectively. These organizations also reflected this tradition, especially as many of the same activists actually became involved in all three of these organizations. So in these Boston-based organizations, we see African Americans, and particularly African American women, have a greater role, including in taking leadership positions. One of these leaders in the early years included Salem native Caroline Ramon Putnam. So hailing from a family who was entrenched in Black activism and the fight for civil rights, Caroline Ramon Putnam continued in her family's work through her leadership in the early Massachusetts suffrage movement. A successful businesswoman and owner of a hair salon and wig factory, Caroline Ramon Putnam had means to support the causes of her own choice. Putnam often worked alongside her brother, Charles Lennox Ramond, who had become a consistent advocate, not only for abolition, but also for women's rights and suffrage in the 1860s and the early 1870s before his death in 1874. So in the early years of these suffrage organizations, Caroline Putnam found herself in Boston working alongside white suffragists, appearing at the founding meeting of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association and joining the New England Women's Suffrage Association. She served as a vice president or on the executive committee of both organizations in the early 1870s. Putnam also helped organize the first suffrage bazaar in Boston in 1870, serving on committees, running tables, and donating trinkets to be sold. The suffrage bazaar became an immensely popular tradition and fundraiser for suffrage organizations. So while we see Caroline Putnam's activity interspersed in the early 1870s, her name appears to drop from suffrage records by the middle of the decade. And the reasoning behind her disappearance from these records is unknown. It possibly could be due to the fact that she often left the country to travel, particularly to visit her sister, Sarah Ramond, who had moved to Europe. And we actually know that Caroline Putnam moved to Europe full-time in the 1880s, living there for the rest of her life. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, another notable Black leader of the Boston suffrage movement, also began her work alongside white suffragists in the 1870s. Born and raised in Boston's Black community of Beacon Hill, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin hailed from a middle-class family. She married George Ruffin, who served in the Massachusetts state legislature, and eventually became the first appointed African-American judge on a district court. Together, they worked for a variety of causes in the years prior to and during the Civil War, including recruiting for the Massachusetts 54th and 55th regiments, which were among the first all-Black raised regiments, as well as dedicating time to charities that particularly helped Southern African Americans. So in the 1870s, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin entered the women's rights movement, joining alongside white suffragists Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe, among others. Ruffin recalled them welcoming her into the movement because they, quote, were broad enough to include no distinction because of race with no distinction because of sex. Josephine Ruffin eventually took leadership positions in two state organizations, the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association, the MWSA, and the Massachusetts School Suffrage Association, which focused on women gaining voting rights in school elections. She also became an active participant in the national AWSA. So in attending suffrage events, Ruffin took a public stance in favor of suffrage. She wrote to the Boston Globe criticizing Massachusetts and New England for their hypocritical opposition to women's suffrage, saying, quote, "It is my belief that the sentiment of New England favors all rights for all, except the ballot for women." Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin used her leadership in suffrage organizations to reach out to Black communities in Boston to encourage support for women's suffrage. A particular campaign prior to the 1885 election demonstrates how Ruffin worked under the auspices of the MWSA to organize a series of suffrage events in the largely Black community in the Beacon Hill and West End neighborhoods of Boston. Local Black and white leaders, including William Lloyd Garrison, Archibald Grimke, and Lucy Stone, as well as Ruffin herself, rallied support for women's suffrage. Holding meetings in private homes and community spaces, they encouraged women to register to vote in school elections, a right that Massachusetts women had won in 1879. And then they called on men to vote for a local representative who supported granting municipal suffrage to women, or the right for women to vote in city elections. In just a few short years after this campaign, Ruffin was actually behind the establishment of the West End Women's Suffrage League. While little is known about this club, which worked as an affiliate of the MWSA, I have found a few articles that discuss its activities. Ruffin served as the league's first president, while other local Black community leaders comprised its 45 founding members, including former abolitionists Lewis and Harriet Hayden, religious activist Eliza Gardner, and attorney Butler Wilson. The league's motto, "All Rights for All," reflected the community's belief in equality across both race and gender. It is the only Boston-affiliated club of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association that I have found with certainty that is comprised of mostly African-American men and women in leadership positions. So in the post-Civil War era to about 1890, we have uncovered some involvement of Black women suffragists in the Boston movement, many working within the largely white organizations. The names that we do have including Caroline Ramond Putnam and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, suggest a potential influence also of class status that gave these women access to the white organizations that maybe other Black women may not have had access to. Historian Rosalind Turburn Penn notes, quote, "Although Black women, as all women, could not vote in Massachusetts, it is safe to say that by the postbellum period, they were more politically aware than those in other areas of the nation, because their men could vote. For this reason, it is surprising that more names of African-American suffragists were not found for Massachusetts during this period." It is surprising that we have not uncovered more African-American suffragists in these formative years of the movement in Boston. In some cases, it could be that we just merely have not been able to identify them from the existing record, or the suffrage records did not even include them in the first place. And other questions that we may perhaps consider is whether these suffrage organizations effectively reached out to Black communities, or whether the goals of these organizations necessarily appealed to them. Even though many of the Boston organizations maintain this larger aspirational goal of equality based on race and gender, their activism and objectives did not necessarily reflect this goal. It took someone like Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin to act as a gatekeeper to encourage suffragists to branch into Black communities. Black women had issues that motivated them, and as Terborg Penn noted, they were politically aware at this time. What they needed was an avenue in which they could align their more widespread activism with the suffrage movement and channel their efforts effectively. And as it happens, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin is largely responsible for creating this channel. From participating in majority white women's clubs, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin saw a need for a club that more greatly included Black women and offered a place to discuss topics of interest to their gender and race. So from this need, Ruffin and about 20 other women founded the Women's Era Club in March of 1893. Their club motto, "Help to Make the World Better," derived from what is believed to be suffragist Lucy Stone's last words. In less than a year, the Women's Era Club grew to over 100 members from Greater Boston. Some white women also joined as members, and the club maintained close ties to white suffragists and civic reformers. When the suffrage newspaper, the Women's Journal, published an article on the founding of the Women's Era Club, it declared it a women's suffrage club. Quote, "As these ladies are able and fearless advocates of women's suffrage, it may be expected that the Women's Era Club will take the lead in educational work for the movement among colored women." And while women's suffrage was an issue of interest to the club and the members of the club, I would argue it's a little too narrow for a classification. As I mentioned earlier, Black women viewed their activism with this wide lens, and seeing discrimination and inequality that prevented progress in their communities, and recognizing that their gender added further disadvantages to themselves. So understanding that suffrage organizations did not necessarily share in this broader view, they knew that in order to address the issues that they cared about, of which suffrage was only one of those issues, Black women needed to organize within their communities. And this is reflected in the Women's Era Club's purpose and agenda, which highlighted the community's need to be a club, for the club to be, quote, "started and led by colored women, because there are, quote, so many questions which as colored women we are called upon to answer." The first report acknowledged the need for Black women to partake in activities for the betterment of the race and encouraged women to come together and organize to do so. It ended with these words, quote, "It cannot but be admitted that we as a race have too frequently limited ourselves to this field with the result of contracting our vision, enfeebling our impulses, and weakening our powers. We, the women of the Women's Era Club, enter the field to work hand in hand with women, generally for humanity and humanity's interests." This last phrase, "for humanity and humanity's interests," shows that this was more than a suffrage club. It was a club with much higher and broader ideals. This is not to say that the Women's Era Club was not actively engaged in the suffrage movement. The club supported and participated in suffrage events, and many members spoke on behalf of women's suffrage, both within the purview of the club and outside of it, reaching out to their community to garner support. Some members, including Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, were already active suffragists, having been members of the West End Women's Suffrage League. But the club's work expanded beyond the topic of women's suffrage. They held club meetings and community lectures on relevant subjects that often affected particularly the Black community or Black women. The Women's Era Club also held carnivals for charities and local institutions, including for homes and hospitals in the Black community. They wrote and distributed pamphlets on discrimination and anti-lynching, and they raised money for scholarships for Black young women aspiring for higher education. Through these activities, the Women's Era Club worked on numerous issues that affected their communities. The Women's Era Club's own journal offers us the most well-documented support for women's suffrage among the Black community in Boston at the turn of the century. In 1894, Josephine Ruffin and her daughter, Florida Ridley, launched the Women's Era Journal. They served as the first editors with assistance from other Women's Era Club members. And while the first voice came from Boston, it soon became the leading African-American club women's publication in the nation, with contributors and editors from around the United States, including representation from Illinois, Tennessee, Colorado, Washington, D.C., and beyond. Noted by historian Teresa Holden, quote, as a feminist publication with all content being directed specifically toward the advancement of women, the journal provided sections on literature, education, health and beauty, as well as news about relevant issues, local politics, as well as the strengthening anti-lynching movement. It became a platform through which Black women could broadcast their voice and be heard. The Women's Era also featured women's suffrage, advertising local events. As editors, Josephine Ruffin and Florida Ridley published several women's suffrage editorials, writing, quote, with the suffragists, the colored woman is in good company. They also took opportunities to combat those who opposed suffrage. In one editorial criticizing the publication of Virginia Baptist, which claimed women were, quote, acting contrary to their divine authority when they exercised the right of suffrage, Ruffin and Ridley scoffed at this argument in their response, quote, the weak, effusive arguments against suffrage can have but one effect on the indifferent, and that is to turn them into suffragists. The Era furthermore provides us with a brief glimpse into the engagement and political awareness towards the issue of women's suffrage in Boston's Black community. In an editorial praising women's suffrage, Ruffin and Ridley wrote, quote, one of the most interesting incidents of the suffrage movement here in Boston is the desire to vote expressed by two inmates of the Home for Aged Colored Women, one of whom is 92 years of age and the other 88. And the spirited, intelligent letter sent by these old ladies to the suffrage leaders speaks volumes, particularly when it is realized that they have had no advantages in the way of education and environment. So unfortunately, I have not been able to locate this letter, nor any information about who these elderly women could have been or to whom they may have sent it. But I think the existence of this letter alone provides us with an example of how the issue of women's suffrage truly extended to all corners of Boston's Black community. Due to the success of the Women's Era Club and Journal, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin believed in the formation of a national Black women's movement to, quote, give solidity, unity of purpose, and national character. She believed Black women from across the country could form a united front in working to uplift their communities and combat racism. With members of the Women's Era Club, Ruffin organized the first national conference for colored women held in Boston in 1895. They discussed a variety of topics, including literature, morality, domesticity, the work of club women, as well as voting rights. As president of the conference, Ruffin voiced her call to arms, quote, our women's movement is a women's movement in that it is led and directed by women for the good of women and men for the benefit of all humanity, which is more than one branch of it. We ask the active interest of our men, and two, we are not drawing the color line. We are women, American women, as intensely interested in all that pertains to such as all American women. We are not alienating or withdrawing. We are only coming to the front, willing to join any others in the same work, and cordially inviting and welcoming others to join us. This conference serves as the birth of the Black Club Women's Movement, creating the foundation for what would eventually become the National Association for Colored Women. The Black Club Women's Movement provided a vehicle through which Black women could work together nationally on a variety of issues, including women's suffrage. As one of the forerunners to this movement, the Women's Era Club of Boston showed the forming of this new avenue in which Black women could engage in activism on multiple fronts, from suffrage and education to employment and discrimination. While several of the members of the Women's Era Club have been identified as participating in suffrage events, that was just one aspect of their interest in their activism. Many more club members also advocated for better education and racial uplift, or challenging injustice in the local anti-lynching movement. The records of the Women's Era Club become more limited in the years following the convention, so our access and our understanding of the club's activity during the last few years of the 19th century are minimal. The club itself dissolved at some point in the following decade. The need to organize among Black women became doubly important with the rise of racism and racial polarization at the turn of the 20th century. While African Americans in the South faced the most violent repercussions, the entirety of the United States suffered negative effects. The joining of the two suffrage organizations in 1890 to form the National American Woman Suffrage Association led to a shift in tactics as racism bubbled up in the movement. Southern white women refused to work alongside Black women, and many Southerners in general feared Black women obtaining the right to vote. And to the dismay of Black suffragists, many white Northern suffragists either allowed this racism to exist, ignoring the plight of Black women, or appealed to it by directly excluding Black women from the movement. The passing of more early suffrage and women's rights reformers compounded the separation, as fewer suffragists who remained had participated in the abolitionist movement and had been more in tune with this sense of interracial collaboration of that period. And this transition coincided with the emergence of the Black Women's Club movement, as many Black women more fervently organized within their communities to make change and to really become less reliant on white support. They also maintain a broad focus on problems of discrimination, racial violence, and community uplift in addition to women's suffrage. And this does not mean that their interest in women's suffrage necessarily decreased. Many Black women continued to believe in the vote and hoped it would help themselves and their communities. So looking at Black women's participation in the Boston suffrage movement for the final stretch of the struggle to the 19th Amendment, we actually have more questions than answers. Mainstream newspapers offer only glimpses here and there of Black activity in the movement, and Boston suffrage organizations often do not clarify its membership or distinguish membership or participation based on race. And the lack of available primary sources makes it difficult to come up with a cohesive story for this time period. So from the limited sources that I have uncovered, we do see an effort from members of the Black community to organize within their community, particularly in the transitioning Black community of the South End and Roxbury neighborhoods of Boston. However, details are often lacking, providing only a small and limited view. Until more sources can be uncovered or digitized, such as local Black newspapers, The Guardian and The Chronicle, we will still miss a large part of the history of their involvement. And so despite these research impediments, I do want to take a few moments to comment on a few notes of interest that I have uncovered in my research thus far. First, I've uncovered a few examples of Black anti-suffrage organizing and opinion in the city. Two newspaper clippings in 1913 note the formation of the Back Bay Pilgrims Colored Women's Anti-Suffrage Association. According to these sources, about 40 women formed this organization, the first of its kind within Black communities in Massachusetts. And several representatives of this organization also participated and spoke in state suffrage hearings that same year. Pauline Hopkins, an activist and editor of the Colored American magazine in Boston, also expressed her doubts in an editorial on women's suffrage, saying, quote, "There's quite a ripple among women just now in favor of women's suffrage. We believe it to be a good thing if limited in some degree. It is right that women vote on such questions as property rights, the wife's personal rights and rights in children, and in all that pertains to the public school. But it seems to us the franchise in its fullest sense is not desirable. Physically, women are not fitted for the politician's life. Morally, we should deplore seeing woman fall from her honorable position as wife and mother to that of the common ward healer, hustling for the crumbs meted out to the faithful of any party in the way of appointments to office. So while it appears with this quote that she's focused on the traditional arguments against women's suffrage, she then offers a more nuanced position, asking the following questions. Quote, is it desirable for us as a race to place the ballot in women's hands? And quote, is the aspect of woman in certain sections such as to inspire us with confidence in the honor of the white woman toward her Black sister? And from these questions, Hopkins makes the following two conclusions. Quote, we ought to hesitate before we affiliate too happily in any project that will give them, white women, greater power than they now possess to crush the weak and helpless. Let us study this question and prove it a good thing for our race before we rush in blindly, even to please those who have been of material benefit to us. So I find these two examples fascinating when it comes to anti-suffrage sentiment. And while we do not know the reason behind why the organization opposed suffrage, we see how Hopkins questions whether women's suffrage would really grant all women the right to vote, or whether it would merely give white women more political power and more opportunity to oppress Black women and other women of color. This was a concern that many Black women shared and considered throughout the suffrage movement. So while racism occurred more frequently in the national suffrage movement with the new tactics to appeal to Southern white voters, drawing links of this type of racism to Boston are difficult to find. The most notable example of racism with the Boston connection involves the Northeastern Federation of Women's Clubs. Established in Boston in 1896 by clubwomen including, again, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, the Northeastern Federation brought together Black clubwomen from Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, among other states. An offshoot of the National Club organization, the Federation dealt with a variety of issues, including the education and self-improvement of Black women. They also took a firm stand against discrimination and racial violence, creating a committee that called on the US government and other organizations to take action against lynchings and racial terrorism that were currently occurring primarily in the South. In alignment with their broad range of activism for women and African Americans, the Northeastern Federation also supported women's suffrage. Several Bostonian women affiliated with the Northeastern Federation appeared in notices of local suffrage events, as well as local anti-lynching protests. This reinforces the determination of so many Black women to become activists on multiple fronts in their communities. So in 1919, the Federation, at this point composed of 6,000 members, applied to join NASA, the National Suffrage Organization. National suffrage leaders, including Carrie Chapman Catt, opposed the organization's admission and encouraged them to rescind their request until after suffrage was won. These leaders demonstrated a willingness to appeal to Southern racism and sideline the rights of African American women in order to push through the passage of the 19th Amendment. And this interaction involving the Northeastern Federation perhaps provides one of the clearest examples of racism against African American suffragists in the Northeast region during the suffrage movement itself. So the last observations I'll share with you come after Massachusetts ratified the 19th Amendment in June of 1919, during which we see a transition from suffrage and ratification activity to voter registration and citizenship education. So Black women were among those who flocked to their local government buildings to register to vote. And according to newspaper accounts, Black women appeared, quote, to appreciate the ballot more than their white sisters. While Boston women had held political classes as early as the 1890s, they now did so on a much larger scale. They reached out to women of a variety of ethnic, racial, class, and religious backgrounds to encourage their participation in these classes. As the suffrage publication, The Woman's Citizen, noted, quote, women of every kind and condition are being reached. For the audiences addressed include neighborhood circles, mothers' clubs, school centers, federated clubs, churches, settlement houses, and miscellaneous organizations of women. Several of the most alert groups are among the colored women. It appears that local Black organizations also took ownership of voter education. For example, the League of Women for Community Service, which was first established in 1918 as a World War I relief group and later focused on the social and educational needs of African American women, appears to have discussed this responsibility. And meeting minutes from October of 1920 also indicate the League hosted a, quote, demonstration on how to cast an intelligent ballot. This activity continued during the final months prior to the 1920 election. And while as a northern state, Massachusetts was among the few states in which a mass of Black women could easily vote in elections. However, this did not mean that some people in Boston still had racist beliefs in who should have the access to the vote. In one such case, an unknown source sent a fake flyer from the fictitious Massachusetts Election Commission to African American communities, likely directed at Black women. So these flyers warned recipients of illegal registration and of potential fines and imprisonment if they voted under these circumstances. So despite facing this intimidation, many Black women of Boston still organized amongst themselves, still registered, and still voted in their first election in 1920. So after generations of work in Boston, they entered the polls alongside men and women to access their hard-fought for political voice. Their experience was not shared by all African American women, though, as numerous barriers prevented women and men of color across the United States from voting. And many communities continued to fight for full voting rights for decades to come. So despite the fact that the lack of available sources has led to more of a spattering of events regarding Black women's participation in the final decades of the suffrage movement in Boston, I hope from these small snippets we get a sense of Black women's suffrage activity, while also recognize that while they continued their fight for women's political representation, they still maintained this broad, multifaceted view of equality across race and gender, fighting for justice on both fronts. Starting with the first public speeches of Mariah Stewart in Boston to the ongoing work happening today, Black women activists have contributed to and led numerous movements for the betterment of our world. And with a broad view of equality and justice, they joined movements that would give a means to achieve progress. When it came to the suffrage movement, many Black women maintained hopeful that women obtaining the right to vote would be a means for uplift for themselves, both as women and as African Americans, giving them a greater voice and the ability to climb politically, socially, and economically. Writing an editorial in 1915, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin echoed this belief shared by many, quote, "We are justified in believing that the success of this movement for equality of the sexes means more progress toward equality of the races." With the right to vote, Black women knew they could more effectively make positive change for their communities, society, and as we have heard, for all humanity. As historian Rosalind Terborg Penn notes, and with whose words I will leave you with, quote, "Although women's suffrage meant different things to different African American women, most believed the ballot was essential to the growth of democracy and to the advancement of human rights in the United States." Thank you. So with that, I'm finished. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Sure.
There we go.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. It was fascinating. So now we have a little time for questions. Would anyone like to go first? You're welcome to unmute yourself or type into the chat. Well, I have one. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your sources. So I saw Library of Congress and Boston Globe and Herald, and were there any sort of unknown or little known archives that you looked at? Just would be interested to understand that process.
Yeah, so a lot of it, as I said earlier, it's just like a spattering. You just kind of have to try, look and find wherever you can. I think my greatest source has been the Woman's Era Journal. which is at the BPL, and it's on microfilm. So there are many hours that I spent just scanning through it because it's not yet digitized. So that was probably my best source, that kind of where I could find everything that one place to look. But otherwise, it was really just kind of looking here and there, trying to glean information from other archival sources. Like I looked a lot. Harvard Schlesinger Library has a lot of different women's suffrage records. So I would kind of skim through that to see in organizational records to see what I could find. But unfortunately, the institutions of historical memory have not historically valued the voices of Black women. So we don't really have any collections of, for Josephine, St. Pierre, Ruffin, or any of these notable activists, at least related to Boston. So it was really just kind of like a needle in the haystack, kind of sifting through suffrage information to see if there was a name I could recognize, or if there's something that I could pick out. And I would have to go through several times, because as I became more familiar with the names, then I would go back and see if I could find people again. So
Wow.
yeah, it wasn't not really as direct, but that's what you kind of have to do, is kind of just go sifting.
Wow. What was this pre-pandemic? Where would this presentation have been given? Was it for the Park Service, or sort of for a community education like this?
Yeah, so it's ideas. I have this one, and I also have one specifically on women of the Women's Era Club and activism in that club, which are, these are for public audiences. So
they're not associated with a certain site, like Park Service site?
I mean, the site is with Boston, and also Boston African American National Historical Site.
Right.
Yeah, so those would be the two sites, but it's something that we have available to go out into the community. So I've given talks at other Boston Public Library sites.
Great. Great. Aida has a question.
To go to the right microphone.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if I heard correctly when you were talking about Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. Did you mention that she was appointed a district court judge?
Her husband was.
Her husband was. Okay. All right. Well, okay. I was hoping I heard.
That would have been really cool, but yeah.
Yes, I was going to ask some more information about that. That was, yeah, okay.
Anyone else have a question? It's a lot of information. Oh, sorry, Marilyn.
I'm curious what Black women were doing in other cities. Were they active in New York or the Midwest? I know the Stantons came from upstate New York. I mean, where was the rest of this activity? Where was Sojourner Truth hanging out, and what else was going on?
So a lot of, I would say, the earlier Black suffragists it was really between, a lot of it was between New York and Boston, especially in the earlier part of the movements. Like, those were the main hubs, but it's certainly expanded throughout the United States and the Midwest. Ida B. Wells is a well-known suffragist, and her work was out of Chicago with the Alpha Suffrage Club. And then you even have in Washington, D.C., there's a lot of women, especially at the turn of the century, who became more active. Mary Church Terrell is from Washington, D.C. So it really, and there's even a lot of, women in the South, so they're working even in, more difficult, with more difficult populations, and trying to advocate for their right to vote when African-American men in the South were even though they technically had the right to vote, there were so many barriers that prevented them. And with the advent of Jim Crow laws, as well as lynchings that were happening, they really had to deal with even more opposition and barriers. But it really spanned the entire United States.
Did it go out west too, to Washington and Oregon and out in that end of the world? Because weren't they some of the earliest states to actually agree to give women the vote?
Yeah, there's a lot of the Western states ended up being among the first to have either various levels of women's suffrage. So some states didn't necessarily grant like full voting rights. It'd be either like presidential elections you could vote in or state elections. But the West, they kind of say that the West opened it up for the rest of the country to be able to kind of push it forward. And that would be an argument that suffragists would use, saying, hey, look, Wyoming didn't go up in flames when women got the right to vote. So we should have the right to vote here.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I will say it's a little bit difficult trying to like smush all of a whole 100+ years of history.
Yeah.
So it's a very kind of long breath, long stroke of a history here.
How about, do you have any recommendations for books for the layperson who would like to learn more about this?
Who I referenced, Martha Jones, her book Vanguard, which just came out last month. It is, I read up to what I needed to for this presentation, but I just finished it yesterday. And it is, as I said, it's going to be a pivotal work in learning about Black women's activism, because it really gives a lot of, has this wide idea. Yeah, I can't praise it enough. It's a great work, and it's very readable. It's not super academic-y or anything.
Okay.
So it's I think it'd be a great introductory kind of, if you want to see about Black women's activism, especially when it comes to having political rights, it'd be a great book.
Okay, thank you. Give one more chance for questions. I think everyone's absorbing all the information. So if there's no more questions, I want to say thank you again to Katie so much for this presentation, and best wishes for your next audiences, and for everyone to have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Good night.
Good night.